Hey, welcome back if you're coming back, or welcome for the first time if it's the first time, whatever it might be. My name is Kevin Stansfield. I suppose, if you care, this is the third installment of a sequence of things. And in my mind, this has been building up to this point. If you are just coming into it on the third go, you go to Colton True Life, probably where you found this anyway, and go back. You can tell the different segments, at least that they're different, because I wore different clothes on each one. But I didn't do that on purpose until this time, because I realized that's how I could tell the difference between the first and the second one. Just if that's of interest to you. How about, since this is Sunday school for True Life, let's start this with prayer, please. Heavenly Father, I thank you for the fact that you are bringing us together in this time and place and in this way. And you are gathering the ones that you want to be hearing what I have to say. And that's a weight, and I surely do pray for your Spirit to be upon me, to use me with, to use me with, to do the things you want to have done in people's hearts. This is the weirdest time in this country's history and our living time. I just pray that the church do something effective. The church being all of us Christian people who have been living all these years of our lives and have maybe never realized how much you are the God that we truly worship, and you have everything under control. So thank you, and I just thank you for the grace that you are showing as we do this. Amen. I think I will take advantage of the fact that I have a mic and I have a camera to tell you, and I have a suspicion that this is one of those times when the person talking is really meaningful to the person listening. It's like, whatever, why is he wasting my time? But this week, I have noticed in particular, the first hour of my day, once I get out of the house, because I'm an essential worker and I drive trucks, I have some time on my hands, and I spend the first hour with nothing but the sound of the engine. And there's not a lot to do on that drive except pray. And that has been awesome for my personal Christian life, to have that. My hands are busy, but my brain's not so much, and I can visit with God. And for at least 2 mornings in a row now, I've been doing, if you're familiar with the Catholic Mass or other high church ceremonies, there comes a point when there's what I call it a responsorial prayer. I'm not sure I'm using the right term for it or not, but what has happened is some prayers have been collected, and the priest will speak these prayers out, typically one sentence-ish, and the audience, the congregation, will respond with, "Lord, hear our prayer." And if you grew up with it, it's just, okay, it's just what you do at that point in the service. But I was finding myself this week, I just couldn't go anywhere in my head, because things were just the things you're worried about. And I know that's true for most of us right now. We have things we're worried about. And I started to do a responsorial prayer with myself, for myself. It would, things like, "Can I trust you?" And that the line was, "Can I trust you with?" And the response is, "Yes, Lord, I can trust you with." So, it started with, "Well, can I trust you with my life?" "Yes, Lord, I can trust you with my life." "Can I trust you with my wife's life?" "Yes, Lord, I can trust you with my wife's life." And it just kept going. And it was interesting. In the course of those 2 mornings, I would get done with the standard prayers, and then this term, it comes from Buddhist meditation, but it really is a very appropriate description, monkey mind. There's just so many things going through your mind. And rather than spending time on them, I would go, "Oh, that's another thing I'm worried about. Can I trust you with my checkbook?" "Yes, Lord, I can trust you with my checkbook." And that monkey thought would just, I'm sure that's not going to be every morning for the rest of my life, but it was 2 mornings out of this week's of my life. And I can't describe to you how soothing it was to go through that responsorial prayer with myself, with God, for myself. And I was telling my wife about it, and It doesn't seem to mean a lot to her. But it meant a lot to me, and I'll offer it to you guys and do what you want with it. Okay, so this is back when I started putting this together. I didn't really know how far this was going to go. I didn't know how many slides it was going to take. I got about this far on the first cycle, and it's taken me now the third session for me to get this deeply into what's going on with this. And this is kind of what was going on in my head when I started all this is very often where a question would start in a classroom. And as a man of faith, I couldn't just go away. I felt pretty compelled by the way things are these days, that you can't just go wading into a faith-filled response to a question like that. Although I will note, if you are radically liberal, you can go into your faith and preach it as truth and use classroom time to do it. And you can hide behind the state and say all you're doing is fulfilling the state's requirements. And you're not wrong. But I've certainly come to the conclusion that an anti-God, ear-God, non-God belief is as much a faith and as much a religion as mine is. But that's, okay, anyway. Get off the political. Let's come back to what we're talking about here. So we have the question, what about the fossils? So here's some things about it. They're real. And those creatures existed. They're there. They were there. And their evidence is still there. Back in the days when I was going to Western Oregon, me and 2 or 3 other people, depending on the day, would meet together in Malala, and we'd commute together to Monmouth. And inevitably, all these people going to college with an hour there and an hour back, you got into conversations, and we were not of the same faith mind at all. We weren't of the same political persuasion at all. And sometimes those got to be rather spirited. But on one of those drives, I recall a man that I was traveling with talked about his wife and her religious background, which is similar to Christianity. And her take on fossils is that they're kind of fake. They're kind of God's joke on us, that they're not something to be taken real. I'm not the one saying that, not at all. They are absolutely real. Those creatures absolutely did exist. And, okay, so that's a given. Next, I would say that the worldwide flood happened all at once is most likely. But I wouldn't entertain... okay, it's hard for me to read this because... Okay. I would entertain the case being made for it coming in separate events for different parts of the globe. Right? And we're going to start talking today a lot about language in the Bible, and for that matter, language that scientists use and how it works. The biggest reason for that is my next point. The existence of all these fossils is the best evidence for such a flood because it fulfills the requirements for fossil formation. In order to get a fossil, you have to take a living organism, you have to bury it fast, you have to put pressure on it, you have to exclude oxygen, and you got to leave it there a long time and let water carry minerals in and move the fleshly parts or shell parts. You got to get them to move out and be replaced with mineral that becomes rock. A flood does that nicely. Catastrophic floods, mind you, not just a lot of rain making the river rise. That ain't going to do it. It's going to take serious landslides occurring. And the way when I read the description of the flood in the Bible, it's talking about the earth breaking up and things going on. And the biblical description of the flood is a beautiful example of how you would get fossils, and lots of them. Now, we're also going to talk about time. I'll mention that at the moment. It gives me trouble to think about the timeline and when we start talking about the timeline, because there's clearly phases in the fossil record where these kinds of critters are going on in this layer, these kinds of critters are going on in this layer. I'm not opposed to the idea there was more than one flood. That doesn't bother me particularly. If only one got recorded, well, okay, we're going to address that after a while too. Okay, next point there. Extinction is an observable fact. Now, there was actually a time, I guess, I'm taking this from science books I read, about the controversy of evolution and how it came to be adopted in science and Darwinism and all that, that there was a time when people truly believed that God would never let something in his creation become extinct. And if that's true, and how would I know? I didn't live in that time. But if that's true, that would sure explain some of the heedless behaviors we saw people involve themselves in. Just in hindsight, to me, from this right now, 2020 perspective, it's like even if you are believing that kind of a thing, just painful stories about how people pursued animals to the last one. You know, the dodos, the great auk. It's painful for me to read those stories and see how just callous people were in their day. By the way, the dodos, one of their main food sources was the seed of a tree, and the tree that seed had to go through the digestive tract of a dodo in order for it to create a new tree. Well, since the dodos have been gone for, I don't know, a couple hundred years, some of the last of those trees are on their way to being dead. So we're going to see one extinction lead to another. It's tragic. Anyway, last point there on this page is creation of a new species, as described by most evolutionists, is not such an observable fact. Now, I kind of remember what I did here. So I'll throw this in now. It'll come up again later, but right now, the coronavirus is a particularly great example, and you can like it or you can lump it, but it is an example of evolution. The reason we're having such issues with it is that it never existed before. The only way out of this is for everybody to get sick with it and live or die, or to come up with a vaccine and get everybody inoculated. That's what we can do. That's what the human species has been doing for a very long time. And that's evolution. And that's clearly observable. We have lots of bacteria that have evolved. And the reason penicillin isn't such a great antibiotic anymore is bacteria has evolved resistance to penicillin. That's evolution. Like it or lump it. The yeah but that I have back to it, though, this whole idea, and we're going to talk more about species in a bit, is the coronavirus, it was a virus before it went through evolution, and it's a virus after it has gone through evolution. It's always been a virus. I don't see any reason to think it's ever going to be anything more than a virus. I don't care how many generations you give it. I don't see it turning into a two-celled organism. Two-celled organisms are far too complicated for a virus to become. Now, I haven't had the opportunity to really get into a go-around because I didn't have enough science classes to go to get going with my own thoughts and then to bring it back to a professor and hear what they had to say to something like that. I have heard professors say, what I'm describing is often called microevolution, and that's great. Got no problem with that. I can't argue that. And then macro is when you actually get one species becoming another. And I have heard stated with great confidence to the point of scorning an opposing thought of, well, there's no difference between micro and macro evolution. Well, yeah, there is. I understand why you would argue that there's no difference in the idea that this change in gene frequencies will go from being one creature to another. I get your argument there. But yeah, it is a big deal to go from being a DNA core and a protein coat to becoming sophisticated enough to be a bacteria cell. That's big. That's a really big difference. And we can't demonstrate that. We can't demonstrate that. And that's just little. That's below the level of our vision. We're not talking about the diversity of creatures that we see, that we see in the fossil record and that we see in the world. And you can argue, well, it just takes more time. Well, that's okay, but that's an argument you can't. Now we've got to talk about transitional species. Why don't we move on? Let's do that. Okay. So, um, wait a minute. It just blinked at me. Let's try this again. Okay. Does that do it? Okay. So there are some current evolutionary requirements. Number one is time. You need huge quantities of time. Or more correctly, you need many reproductive cycles. So that's where I can readily concede viruses evolve, because they have had, within our time as human beings, when you've understood and been able to study and get what's going on with them, there's been enough time for them to evolve as we watch them. Bacteria, same thing. There was a little drill I used to do with kids where you take a single bacteria cell, give him ideal conditions, assume that he's multiplying every 20 minutes, doubling every 20 minutes, and it doesn't take the 24-hour period to get a whole bunch of bacteria. So bacteria have had plenty of time to evolve to the point of being penicillin resistant and things like that. But again, they were bacteria before they started to evolve. They're still bacteria after they've evolved. Okay, the next thing that you've got to have to get evolution to happen is you have to have mutations. And again, most mutations are bad. Most often for the organism, it's the end of the road if you mutate. But then the third thing there is if you have selective pressure. So you've got all these mutations going on, and it takes a lot of generations to get mutations of any kind. It takes a lot more to get one that might give you a break in life, and that has to be at the right time to respond to some kind of selective pressure, meaning there's something going on where these creatures live that makes that mutation work well enough for them to survive and reproduce. I didn't say better because there's not necessarily, because the mutation allows you to survive, it doesn't mean you're better than the forebears. It might mean that, but it doesn't automatically mean that. And it seems, from what I have talked about and observed and studied on, sooner or later, whatever you're adapted for is no longer good for you. It's kind of a leap, but we do this with evolution all the time. I am now living through a time where the things I was taught about how to behave in society, about how to behave in the workplace, about how to behave as a male, some of those things are deadly socially. In evolutionary terms, I better drop them or you will pay the price. And in fact, in my opinion, I have paid the price in some of my professional adventures because I didn't pick up on it fast enough and change fast enough to satisfy society. That's a whole other thing we could go down, but it's not the point. Let's move on to the next here. All right, so here's a fork in the road, what to talk about next. So first one that I have on there is gradualism versus catastrophism, and I'm not sure I'm using the right words. And this could be both biological, geological, and we could probably extend this to any area of life you want to talk about. But gradualism is the idea that as today, and there's actually, and I didn't take the time, I wish I would have kept my hands on one of the textbooks that I had been using most recently because I could go back and find this guy's name. But back in the 1800s, some guys in the British Isles came up with this idea that whatever we're looking at right now is kind of how it's always been. The weather over the course of a year today is about like the weather was over the course of a year last year, and about the way it was 20 years ago, and it's about the way it was 1,000,000 years ago. That's a belief, and in fact, it's a bedrock belief for evolution. Catastrophism says, no, from time to time, some serious catastrophes come along. And this is argued as though it's got to be one or the other. I would say, fairly obviously, it's both. That yes, generally the weather has been generally the same way it is. The globe that we live on is more or less the kind of the way it's always been. But there have been catastrophes, and we see those from time to time. If the coronavirus was just a little more deadly, we'd be having a catastrophe as a species right now, and it'd be more than our economics. Bubonic plague was a whole lot more of a catastrophe. I would really like to know, and there's just no way to do it except to travel through time. I'd really like to know what was in the human genome in the 1300s in England before and after the Black Plague went through. Because the Black Plague seriously thinned the human herd. And we are all descendants of the survivors. what kind of genetics did the people that died have? I'd really like to know. And we can dig up the old bodies and do some things with it, but there's more to it, and there's stuff in there to think about. The next thing, time, the Big Bang. Okay, how did time get started? I understand science too. There was a time when time started. Well, there was something before. At least we humans are obligated to that. You know, there was a point of me starting, but there was things going on before. And there's going to be things after I cease. Our known universe has a starting point, but there was something before. And that, boy, the Catholic Church especially talks about mystery. And I think we Protestants should talk about mystery too. There's mystery there. It's kind of, okay. So, all right. Other thing about time is how is it divided and how long does it go on? And does it always go the way it's going now? Kind of goes back to the first thought there. Is gradualism, has it always been a 24-hour clock? We know that the earth wobbles back and forth. We know that the earth's poles reverse from time to time. You know, we know things don't always stay the same as they are right now. And yet we conduct our arguments with each other as though those were all rock steady and never changed. Rock steady, I think, is its own little oxymoron. But anyway, so, and we really need to talk about species, and I don't know, boy, this is going to be hard to get it all in. Let's just move on. All right, so Big Bang. This is not everything there is to talk about, but it's a quick thing to talk about. In the classic Christian understanding of the world, there's this thing called ex nihilo, which is Latin for out of nothing. And it is our understanding of how God created. Basically, because God said that's how he created. There's nothing there, and then God spoke, and something is happening. And it's out of nothing. Now, the Big Bang Theory says that something that was infinitely small. Now, again, that seems kind of oxymoronic to me, to use a word like infinity and infinitely small. There's a logic problem there. But, okay, infinitely small, and it exploded and started this universe that we're having. To my mind, I cannot see any pragmatic difference between those 2 points. I can't see a pragmatic difference between God speaking, and it exists, and that being a Big Bang. It sounded to me like science had already gotten there. But leave it to my fundamentalist Christian brothers to say, no. Out of nothing means out of nothing. Infinitely small means there was something. Okay, fine. If you want to have that argument with yourself, go ahead and have that argument with yourself. Go ahead and have that argument with your professor at OSU. That's fine. You can have that argument. To me, it sure looks like you're having a fight because you just want one. I can't see a functional difference between infinitely small, because where's the limit of smallness in infinity? We mentioned that idea a while back. It's infinite. It's infinite. And by the way, infinite is a description for God. Okay, but if you want to have an argument over that, go ahead. I don't have that argument. I see those things as a secular way and a religious way of saying the same thing. And that's enough of that slide. We'll move it on. So this is just, I went to the internet and found this. This is not an unusual way to present the way time is divided. A chart very much like this, almost with the same colors, came out of the textbook I used with my class. But then I went and I found another one just because it's kind of interesting. Please notice eon, era, period. And on the next one, they have the era and the period, but then they have the epoch. And the reason I wanted this or epoch, how's that anyway? The highlighted yellow is interesting to me because when I was Caleb's age in high school, they told us that we were in the epoch, the Holocene epoch. That was right up to common modern day. But since, I don't know, I've started being aware of it in the last 10 years, Mankind has put such a mark on the planet that they consider us to be it's beginning to be accepted in scientific circles that we have started a new epoch. And now it's the Anthropocene, anthro having to do anthropology, study of mankind, that we are in the man epoch. And man here does not mean male. Mrs. Beale in 7th grade made this very clear. When you use the man in that term, it means mankind, all human beings, all females, all males. I know that that's really politically incorrect. That's one of the things I haven't caught up with. Apologies if I've offended you. All right, so I just thought that was interesting. So there's a whole bunch of time going on here. And typically, we're talking about 4.5 billion years, with most of that time being back here. And then we get up into the eras that are more interesting to us. You start with the Cambrian is where you start seeing some of those shells and sea life, and the Earth. What we have to look at has a lot to do with water creatures. You have to go quite a ways up to see where it says Permian. That's where the critters that became coal and oil were living, and that Carboniferous, the reason they call it that is because that's where our carbon resources, the life on the planet at that point is what got buried and turned into petroleum and coal. How did all that stuff get buried? I don't know. Sounds like a flood to me. Anyway, so, and okay, if you're going to say it was the flood that did that, how do you deal with the fact that not all those creatures crossed over? I'm starting to get ahead of myself in what I'm going to present here, but creatures, especially, this is something I've really wondered. Creatures that lived in the water. Well, let's assume that all the land creatures made it onto the ark for the moment, but what about the sea creatures? They by their nature can't live in an ark. Yes, they cannot. And how come they didn't all make it through? Because obviously some did. And I want to look at, and this is where I should have done this a while back. Answers in Genesis, Ken Ham. He's a no-kidding scientist who is generally ignored by the secular scientific world because he doesn't buy their stuff. He's gone to their schools, taken their degrees, but doesn't buy their stuff. Bill Nye, in fact, had a whole documentary that I watched on Netflix where he is fighting against Ken Ham, and that's too bad. But anyway, so getting back to this, an idea that came out of Answers in Genesis for me, Spirit Lake, when Mount St. Helens went off, Spirit Lake got mowed over by all that material coming out of the mountain, and the assumption was that lake was dead. And as it turns out, that lake is not dead. And in fact, when scientists started going in there and checking out that lake, yes, a great deal of that lake was dead. When you take the earth and crack it like an egg, and there's some nasty stuff underneath our soil, and there's some poisonous gases that come out of volcanoes. So if you're doing all those things while you're breaking up our earth and flooding the earth, you are polluting the waters of the world all at once right now. But God always creates refuge. And there were spots in Spirit Lake where the springs that fed that lake were still functioning. And when scientists got to that got into that lake and started checking it out, what do you know? Not every fish in that lake died. There were still trout going through their life cycle in this little pool of clean water in a poisoned lake. So they're surrounded by poison, but as long as they stayed right there in that zone, that 5-foot wide pool, they could go through their life cycle and they were preserved. I think that's a real nice picture of what happened in our oceans back during the flood. Now, there's so many details to argue about. There's so many details to argue about. I'm not talking about, I'm just giving general principles of how I think my way through the scientific faith conflicts. Okay, so moving on. So there's a whole lot of time here. And let me get on with this because let's see if we can get to this. Okay, so now time. So I looked at Genesis 2:8. The Garden of Eden was a new work placed in God's overall creation. Again, this is one of those things that we Bible people could go at each other with knives over, metaphorical, of course. That whether or not God did all of creation and then did the Garden of Eden, or whether it was because in my mind as a child, I can tell you for sure that my imagery of creation was that all of creation was making this Garden of Eden. But this just lately, when I go back and look at this again, Genesis 2:8, it's stated as a separate act, at least the way I read it now. Okay? So the next point here is if the Garden of Eden is a separate act from the rest of creation, then there's the possibility of a lot of time going on before humans, before we humans try to account for any of that. There's a big space there for stuff to happen. Just a really big space. This is where I don't care so much what my scientific people say to me, but I get real intimidated by what my theological people say to me because they know their language. As I said before, I didn't study the original languages, and I see that as a serious weakness now in my time and when I'm trying to deal with these kind of questions. So anyway, there's a spot there, conceivably, where a whole lot of time is unaccounted for. So my next bullet point there is the Genesis account did not intend, and this is a big idea. Probably should have highlighted it, but you could if I did anyway. Did not intend to be a science textbook explanation. That way of thinking had not been invented yet. People didn't even think about trying. The invention of writing hadn't occurred. The methods of science are only 300-400 years old. The way we think is normal to think is not the way people thought before, and we don't know the difference. And we can't know the difference until we are in their culture, and the only way we're going to do that is to go hang out with the Indian tribe in South America, or move through time to really get how differently people thought about stuff and how they kept track of it. And before we invented writing and a reasonable way to keep written things from being destroyed, we did it through legend and we did it through oral tradition. And I suspect most of us have at least one mother-in-law that you know the story that she's telling you can't be quite right. And until you go back and talk to the person that she got the story from, you can't quite get it straight. And oral tradition can get a little twiggy. On the other hand, when they have studied oral tradition, and modern anthropologists have gone and studied societies that do oral traditions are pretty robust at keeping central truth of the story preserved from storyteller to storyteller. But we could talk about that. We won't. So, earlier, let's see. Now, I think I might be a little bit out of sequence here. What did I do? Okay, I'm going to go to here, and then I'm going to go back. So the first bullet point there, a species. This is just the definition here. It's a biological species is a group of organisms that can reproduce with one another in nature and produce fertile offspring. That's probably something you were taught in your time. There is an alternative one that's being used more, and that is that species can also be defined based on a shared evolutionary history and ancestry. Does anybody hear the sound of squishing going on there? We were real solid when I was school age about biological species as a group of organisms that can reproduce with one another in nature and produce fertile offspring. Okay, then now by that definition, there's no difference between a wolf and a dog. Oh, yes, there is. Now, they can reproduce together and reproduce fertile offspring, who can then reproduce themselves. But science insists that those two different species, and I would agree with science in insisting that that's two different species, but you're getting squishy science on what you mean by a species here. So now I'll go back. Oh, okay. Oh my goodness. There we go. Now back here in Genesis, here's another place that my biblical scholars might get unhappy with me, but I think we get a little squishy when we translate the Bible here. So in Genesis 5:3, there's an accounting of generations, and it says, when Adam was 130 years old, his son Seth was born, and Seth was the very image of his father. This is the New Living Translation as translated in 1996. I didn't realize this till I came across it on the web, but there's been 2 revisions since this, or retranslations since then. And there is an alternative translation that is possible. You are not messing with the translation. You're not messing with the original language to say the underlying part, his son Seth was born. It is reasonable with that language, according to the translators of this particular translation, to say his son, the ancestor of Seth, was born. Now, if you're going to put that second underlying piece in for his son Seth was born, you've already built in a big squish factor for time. And this whole thing is organized around time because evolution requires time. If you don't have the time, you don't get evolution. And I think there's some space in the Bible that it does not show up in a quick reading of any of the English translations, at least, that there's possibilities there. Am I willing to pound this down and make a point and get ugly about it? No, not at all. I'm just saying that both from the science side of things and from the faith side of things, there's squish factors here. There's space for some grace towards each other on these issues. And there's space for some truth that is not necessarily, it doesn't fit your particular worldview at the moment. And again, it's a really big deal. The bullet point just above there, right here. The Bible is everything we have to know. God was merciful to us and gave us everything we had to know. He did not give us everything there is to know. That's a big difference. That's a big deal to get that in your head. There's lots of things to know that are extra biblical. And I'm really hammering time myself right now. So let's move on with this. Okay. Now, the next thing down here, we already talked about the language thing of species and how that's a little squishy in the scientific thing. Next, Genesis 1:24, then God said, let earth bring forth the living creature, each according to its kind. And I've heard Answers in Genesis talk about how kind is talking about species or species groups, and I'm kind of quoting them, but I didn't go look them up again, so if I'm doing this incorrectly, my apologies. In any case, the word kind is important. It's key. So this is, I do clearly remember this. If we're talking about cattle, there's reasonable evidence that there was a wild cattle existent in the Middle East and Europe that we have mostly, in fact, there's efforts right now, if you care to look it up, and I don't know how to say the name, Auroch, the wild bulls of Bashan, but they were the ancestors of all our modern cattle species. And there are people that are trying to get them back, and and it's really interesting to try to get some of the original species that used to roam Europe to refurbish European land, and it's very interesting. But the point is, they're trying to get back to the original single species of wild cattle, and all of our domestic cattle have descended from that. And because we have evolved them or bred them for what we wanted out of them, we have mutated them to the point where it's a struggle to get back to that original wild kind. So the idea that it's possible that God created some basic models and then built in the ability to become other species. Remember, we're a little squishy about that, but science is allowing for the idea that there's a shared evolutionary history and ancestry. And I don't think that necessarily does violence to how the scriptures describe it. So God makes one basic four-legged cow-like animal, and out of that comes at least 3 different current species of bison, plus at least one species of bison that we have lots of evidence of people eating across the American West because they were longhorn bison. Anyway, so that I think that idea's got some merit there to work on that, and you can spend a career in honest, good science without ever violating your Christian heart and studying something that God forbids. Okay, moving on here. It was time for a picture. So I got a picture of this T-Rex here. Those are the guys that are really, exciting. If we go, I'm not going to do this because I'm afraid I'll mess up the screen here. But if you go back to the timeline, these guys, if I'm getting this right, were was it millions of years? I don't know. That is the conventional way we speak of it now. Was it thousands of years instead of millions? I don't know. And I'm not willing to have a fight. But in order to have this conversation, we'll use the term millions of years. These guys were millions of years after some of those world-famous fossils, at least as far as we know. So there were life forms before these guys and life forms after these guys. And good news because, wow, I wouldn't want to live with that creature on this planet. Thank you very much. So, the next bullet point there, why are we assuming they followed life cycles as life cycles currently occur? And I do believe this is an Answers in Genesis concept, that maybe those guys, much like some reptiles today, they really never quit growing. And we keep finding bigger and bigger T-Rexes. And we keep setting the record for the biggest Rex ever found. And it occurs to me to just wonder out loud, why are we assuming that they terminated at some site? Why would they ever quit growing? And that's that next point. But I will point this out, as they find that one of the old ones or the big ones they found, they're saying that it was a very old creature and that it lived an extremely violent life. There's evidence of broken bones all over that animal's body. And it pinged in my mind the point when God's starting to get ready with Noah and to do the flood, that he's just heartbroken with how violent his creation has become, how that was not he didn't have that in mind, but that the world had just become massively violent. Now, again, as a kid, probably from my Sunday school teacher, I kind of had this image that we're talking about men, but I don't know why we have to limit it to mankind. I don't know that God was necessarily happy, because remember, Adam introduced sin, and sin affected everything. So these creatures that had every reason to get along with each other now don't. And it's just a wildly crazy world that God didn't want. That wasn't what he had in mind. And that's just think about that. That's a meditation point, if you will. Next, you might recognize this from Star Wars, if you're a Star Wars fan. Yeah. Okay, so Job, the book of Job talks in chapter 40 and chapter 41 about the behemoth and the Leviathan. There are people that have struggled to define or figure out what those guys were. I am very willing to say that those were the last remnants of some of these dinosaurs still on Earth. That makes more sense to me than trying to make it be a hippopotamus or whatever. Again, if you're going to buy the gradualism argument that the planet is more or less the same way it always was, why wouldn't there be the occasional, and again, this is definitely Answers in Genesis, St. George slaying the dragon? Why wasn't it the last dinosaur alive on the continent of Europe? Why couldn't it be that? I realize the scientists go, you joke. I don't know that science has a good reason for why that can't be true. Yeah, all right. So there's possibilities in this Bible that do not conflict with what science says. If you can let your mind be open, science-oriented people, and if you can allow God to not be in your box, Christian fundamentalists and others like me, if we can let God be big and just do what he will, and if we can let him get what he wants done with life, these things are possible. Moving on here. This is an example of horses. So if we want to see evolution, then we ought to be able to see it here. So horses, and there's the scientific name, and donkeys, we all know, if you cross those, you get a mule. Crossbreeds are nearly always sterile. I don't know if please, some of you horse people, please talk to me about this later, because I really like to hear stories. Has anybody out there ever heard of a mule that had a colt? I don't know if it's possible or not, but I think I've heard that it has been known to happen once in a while. And I don't know that the foal is all that great. I don't know that it survives long, but the science behind that is horses have 64 chromosomes, 32 pairs. Just for comparison, people have 23 pairs. And mice, which are much smaller creatures, I can't remember the exact number, but they have a lot. They have more than humans. Anyway, a donkey has 62 chromosomes, so that's 31 pairs. So when you have a horse and a donkey cross, you get 63 chromosomes, and the pair thing, there's one chromosome floating around looking for a partner, and that ends its ability to reproduce. Now, as it turns out, mules are really awesome for what you want to do with mules. They might not be your favorite ride, but I know there's people that would rather ride a mule than a horse. And because the mule's smart enough not to do things that horses... I'll just quit because I'm not a horse person. I'm going to make somebody mad. So anyway, so here we go. This is something that secular scientists might point to and say, this is starting to show us how species can happen. So, okay. What about, and this, I thank Caleb for this, what about the sons of God, and depending on your translation, the Nephilim? And the very first thing I thought about, here's the verse, again, out of New Living Translation. In those days, and for some time after, giant Nephilites lived on the earth. For whenever the sons of God had intercourse with women, they gave birth to children who became the heroes and famous warriors of ancient times. And let's see what I said to myself next. New King James Version, because these are the two versions I had at home and readily available to myself. There were, and there's in parentheses, or the way they chose to translate it there, was giants on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So I'm looking at the clock. I'm really running out of time. I'm sorry. So first thought that came to me after what I was talking last week was, well, whatever these giants or Nephilim were, they had DNA. And whatever that DNA was, it was appropriate enough to create living descendants. And whatever they were, again, people writing before the age of scientific thinking that we do in this modern era, how would you describe that? So let me get onto a slide that comes after these two things. It is a fact, human evolution, it's a fact right now that all current humans have a smidge of Neanderthal DNA in them. By the way, Neanderthals had bigger brains than we do. That's just a measurement of craniums. So what's a species and what isn't? Dan asked me, how many kinds of people or humankind was there? And we have discovered little itty-bitty, hobbit-sized skeletons in South Pacific Islands. And depending on, if you want to go down a rabbit hole, type in giants in an internet search and start reading the stuff that comes up there. There are arguments that the skeletons of giants have long been known and have long been suppressed. Okay, so Homo sapiens and Neanderthal, I don't know what their scientific name is, and let's say that these giants are real and these hobbits are real and they all have different scientific names. And okay, and apparently not only can they interbreed, but the crossbreeds are us. We are the crossbreeds that came out of that, and we're not sterile. So science has a problem here with its definitions, and I think we Christians have the answer if we just relax a little bit and not get so uptight about insisting that God fit in our box with how we understand science. I'm pretty sure there was lots of different kinds of humans, and I'm pretty sure that those giants were scary fellas. And I think that our, to this day, legends are based on things that really existed and really happened. They really did. Now, we moderns are terrible at preserving oral traditions. And we depend on written word, and I'm really curious how well we're going to do in the future now that we're depending on electronics ways of preserving things. You can't just dig that out from under a rock and get something out of it. Your thumb drive, once you... Okay, never mind. So, before I distracted myself, I had a thought I was going to go to. In any case, I think there have been lots of different human-like humans. And God didn't tell us about all of them. He told us about what's relevant for us to know. Did God have something going on the side other than Adam and Eve? I don't know that I'm ready to say that. I'm not sure that I'm ready to exclude that. I understand there's this mystery. Marriage is mysterious. Every couple has their own mystery going on. The work of Christ on the cross is a mystery to me. The way the church exists and has continued to exist, and I believe will right up until the final moments, that's mysterious. And I think this is another one of God's mysteries. There's things in there, but let's remember Proverbs. It's His glory to hide it. It's a king's glory to seek it out. And He made all of us who are His sons kings. That's okay. All right, moving on because I'm really running out of time again. Okay, so we already talked about this. Really, we've observed evolution in the real world. What I am not content to concede is that we have seen one species move into a new species. We see related species. We see foxes. You can breed those with dogs too. And we've got all these canine species that seem to be able to interbreed and give us living offspring. To my mind, that means that they're all one species, but now scientists would freak out if I didn't. No, you can't do that. Okay, fine. There's some space in here. Somewhere there's space in here to quit beating each other on these questions. And let's just go ahead and let's do a conclusion. So here are my conclusions. These are the things that I'm really willing to say and contend for. God created the world and earth that we live in and on. He did. He created this world. And God's word is accurate, but it is not exhaustive in provision of information. And what's even, I should have put another bullet in here, what's even more important about that is I am so limited in my abilities and my understanding. I am so limited in what I know and how I know and my ability to think. I am such a limited human being that I don't even get a good grasp on what He did show me. And that was my excuse back in Bible school, why I didn't do these other things, is why I didn't study the languages, because if I could just understand and actually implement the things that Jesus told us to do with our lives as translated into English, if I could just do that, I'd be a better man than I am right now. And that was true when I was 20, and it's true now. If God did reveal more, what good would it do me? I couldn't do much with it. My understandings are just too poor. So, next, all truth belongs to God and is in and of God. If it's true, it's somewhere in God's business. Next one is man's efforts are flawed and subject to revision. That's what that little diatribe I was doing just a moment ago. I am so limited in what I am able to do. And finally, man's understandings are flawed and subject to revision. This is science. This is what science is all about. It's core science, that we always question what we think we know in science, and that we're always willing to revise it. So there it is. I've taken over 3 hours or so to spread this out over 3 presentations. That's my list. That's what I'm working with whenever I approach a science question, and for that matter, when I'm approaching a biblical question. There's just more to all of it than I can understand. There's more mystery to all of this than we should concede that there's just a whole lot of mystery to this. And God did not bother to reveal it all to us. And again, that's what heaven's so cool. I think that that's going to be part of what we're doing in heaven, is catching on to all these things. You know, other places, we could talk about light, but no, can't. But we could talk about light. Oh my goodness, what Scripture has to say about light, what science has to say about light. Oh, light. Oh man, I just need to quit talking. There's lots of things to get excited about, and it's all mysterious. And God is God. If you've built the box, He's going to break it. And if you try to resist that, other things will get broken besides your box. And just rest assured, God is God. He is King of all. And okay. Not a real graceful way to end this, but I'm going to stop. I'm just mumbling now. All right, let's pray and let's be done with this. Father, I don't know that this ended as well as I would have liked it to, but I sure pray that you have been able to use this with the right people at the right time to get them where you want to go. Because if there's anything I'm certain of, it's that you created us, you love us, and that you want us to be with you. You've provided the method and the means through Jesus Christ. You provided the signposts in our scriptures, and we just need to seek you above all else. And I just pray that as we go through this time, this moment in our human history, our national history, that we get real serious about you and realize that we can trust you with every single worry we have. I pray these things in the name of our Savior, Jesus Christ, your Son. Amen.